everybody, and welcome back to Simply Human YouTube channel and podcast. Hi, Karen.
Hey, Christina, how are you?
I'm doing good. We're going to be talking about dealing with blaming and blame shifting behavior. You might come across this in the workplace, at home, or maybe even inside yourself. For those of you who have an inner critic, you know what I'm talking about, that you've got an inner critic who's always blaming you for everything. So we're going to be talking about how to respond effectively to someone who uses blame as an avoidance strategy, because that could be really tricky. Or if you are a blamer, you might feel stuck in unhelpful patterns and cycles of negativity, and they're not serving you anymore. So we're hoping that this episode, we can give you some quick strategies to help you deal with the blamers in your life.
And so before we actually start, don't forget to hit the like button, to subscribe to the channel, share, and hit that notification button so you know when our new episodes are posted. And for you podcast listeners, hit the text us link with your comments and questions. So, Christina, just before we start off and we're talking about this topic, when you say blaming and blame shifting, let's focus on what it really means in your definition so we're all on the same page. So how would you define them?
When we're talking about blaming, I think that's an obvious one. And that is when someone places responsibility for a mistake or problem on someone else. And it may be accurate, but it also can be not accurate. And then we move more into what's called blame shifting. And that's when someone is deflecting responsibility away from themselves and onto others. When people are blame shifting and this avoiding responsibility, it is often much more difficult to address what the problem is, because we all have to start at accountability and responsibility in order to move forward into coming up with solutions. So another way to think about blame, it's this strategy or defense strategy that we do to discharge uncomfortable emotions that we're feeling within ourselves. And those emotions can be anger, it can be shame, resentment, anxiety, helplessness, or guilt. And like a lot of the other challenging behaviors we've talked about, these behaviors are pretty deeply ingrained survival behaviors. And it serves as a defense mechanism to protect ourselves from feeling that emotional pain or that fear of being thrown out of the cave, which we've talked about a lot. But even though it's this survival strategy, like a lot of the other strategies we've mentioned that are no longer serving, instead of reducing conflict, it tends to increase conflict and resentment and lack of resolution.
I also think in the past when I used to blame a lot, I'd always would blame somebody else and then feel guilty.
Oh,
Because I knew that, I shifted the blame because I didn't want to get in trouble. But then later I'd feel guilty. And then it wasn't resentment. I actually felt guilty, like, I shouldn't have done that. Oh my gosh, I should not have blamed it.
but Karen, I think that's actually a good sign, because if you actually feel guilty, it's because a part of you knows that the blaming behavior is not something you should be doing. And the guilt is coming. Remember, guilt is the emotion we feel when we know that we're doing something wrong. So that's actually a really healthy sign that you felt guilt. Because I don't know, haven't you come across people maybe in the workplace who engage in blaming and they can sleep at night?
Yeah, and I think that's where I'm going to talk about later on. We talk about corporations and how we blame. We do naturally do it as a way not to get in trouble, get fired, get a bad performance or something. So you always talk about where you automatically do some of these things just because it becomes unconscious, because that's the way you do to protect yourself. So that's true. So true what you said earlier.
Yeah, actually, we see this behavior really starting at quite young an age. So anyone who's a parent out there, you may have come across this when you're trying to discipline your child or teach them something that, oh, you're not supposed to do that, you're met with, I didn't do it. And we have a couple of videos here because we see it in children And some of you may have seen some of these videos that, even when you're scolding like a dog, they'll point to the other dog. Like I had 2 dogs and one would always get in trouble. And it was so funny. So the dog who got in trouble was Sydney. And I would come home and she would have like torn things apart or whatnot. So she'd be skulking because she knew that she did something wrong. But my other dog like would totally rat her out. Normally my other dog, my Labrador, was a really submissive, but when she knew that Sydney did something wrong, she would run up to the door all proud. She'd put her head over the bad dog's shoulders to show dominance. And when she saw my expression going, oh my God, what happened? My Labrador start dancing and like putting her head over the other dog. It's like, oh, Sydney did it. It's oh, and you're busted and mom's mad. So, and I know people say dogs don't feel these, that we're projecting what humans do, but I'm sorry, I wouldn't know that something had happened. And these dogs came and Sam would just rat out Sydney.
Oh, I know. I'm glad you shared that story because I've always wondered if it was not really happening. Like they kind of like, because you don't know what's fake and when you see it online and stuff. So now you actually tell me and I trust you. I know you wouldn't make up a story. So that's kind of cool that actually happened.
Oh, yeah. No, they do feel guilt. Like I would come home
that's so interesting.
and I wouldn't know anything had happened except the assertive dog would be skulking. And I would be, it's what would trigger me to say, oh, did something happen? Otherwise, I wouldn't know something had happened because maybe it's in another room. Then I find the disaster in the other room. But yeah, she knew that, mom's going to get mad.
Well, it's so funny because I can't wait to look at these videos. So why don't you share the videos?
On the bed.
Daddy.
Who's jumping on the bed?
Daddy.
What? What's that? Who did that?
No. Did I do it?
Huh. She said,
Did you do it? No.
Who did it?
Teddy do it?
Camden did?
Huh?
Really?
Or did you do it? Teddy do it. Did Mama do it?
Really?
No.
Do you want me to stay here or move?
Who put the toy inside the cup?
Me?
Huh?
No.
Who did it?
Somebody did it.
Simba, did you do this?
Mm-hmm.
So Simba put that in there.
Yeah?
Did Joya do it?
No.
Joya didn't do it?
Mm-mm.
Who did it?
Somebody did it.
Simba did it?
Mm-hmm.
Who took the cookie off the counter?
Who did this mess?
Oh, Christina, you know what? After watching these videos, it's making me think. When I was a child, I realized how much I blamed my grandparents. I blamed them a lot because they couldn't speak English. So something would happen, I would say, it's grandma's fault because of, I don't know what it was, but I remember blaming my grandparents a lot because they couldn't speak
wouldn't
English.
know.
They wouldn't know
even
what I was blaming them about. I know, unless my mom asked, and then I would have to commit. But very few times. Like I remember even with like why I was late and I didn't get ready because grandma didn't tell me. Grandma's like, and it was blaming her, even though I know I'm old enough to do it. But grandma didn't tell, so I was blaming her. But my mom always wouldn't check with my grandparents. I knew that too. So it's just interesting how I never thought about that, and here I'm 60 years old. That's like when I was younger, when they're living with us, and I'm blaming them. Like, oh my gosh! So I got to go say a prayer and tell them.
Yeah, it's a really natural response, especially when you're younger and you're going to get in trouble. That's really scary.
Yeah, I did not want to get
So
scared. I don't want to get yelled at by mom. So.
Yeah. So let's talk about the impact, though, in adult life. What's the impact when you're having to deal with someone who blames all the time or they engage in blame shifting? It can be really difficult to maintain respect for someone who constantly blames others because it is a pattern of avoiding responsibility. So if this is a partner or you see a boss doing that and it affects the way we see them as leaders, we see them as partners, like it's very damaging to lose that respect. The negative tone of blaming creates stress. I see this in marriages where there's a lot of blame being cast. And I've heard spouses complaining that their partner is very prone to getting aggravated, say in traffic, and maybe they were running late and that's why they're stressed. And then instead of taking responsibility for that, they're yelling at every other driver on the road and there's road rage. And now they're sitting in the passenger side feeling really uncomfortable and unsafe because they don't know how to calm it down. Because trying to discharge this feeling onto random drivers, it actually doesn't discharge the feeling very well. Like the person really needs to just be like, okay, yeah, I should have planned ahead and gotten out of the house sooner. And now we're stuck in traffic. Like they would have calmed down sooner than trying to project it and blame all the other drivers on the freeway, because that's not going to change the situation. Like, can you kind of see how that doesn't work really well?
Yeah, I see that. I think a blaming is part of our culture, though. I think part of our culture, truly, we grow up blaming so we don't get in trouble. It's again that primal way of ensuring that you're safe until you become more self-aware and realize that aggravation isn't helping anybody because that resentment holds within you. So nobody in the car, the other cars, you're blaming them because they have no idea. If anything, they'll give you a finger back. Seriously, right? Because they don't know. Because it's interesting, though, how much it is within our own culture.
Yeah, I think that's why we wanted to do this topic about challenging people and blaming, is because we all do it. We do it so instinctively that we may not be really thinking about the consequences of blame and how blame contributes to this negativity, escalation of conflict, increased anxiety, increased mistrust. It really has adverse consequences. And when we talk about blame shifters, that can be so damaging in your relationship. You're always angry, and that's why I didn't do X, Y, Z.
I remember a story and regarding my daughter, and I remember when she was small, and I remember being in the car and had a behavior. And I don't remember what the behavior was, but I remember it was a bad behavior. And it could be swearing a word. And I said, "You learned that from Dad, didn't you?" Because I was really blaming Mark. And then she said, "No, I learned it from you." Because I automatically went with this instinctual where I never thought it would be myself, right? I was so embarrassed when no. I said, no, it's your dad. She kept arguing with me. No, it's you, Mom. And then I was like, oh. So I think it's just so funny when you slow it down. You're like, oh my gosh, I do say that.
Let's get back and I just want to go over one more, which is self-blame. Because we might
I'm so glad with that one. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I'm talking about is you might have a inner critic and it uses blame. It's the self-talk within yourself that's saying, oh, you shouldn't have said that. You shouldn't have told that joke. That's why people are walking away. It's all your fault. All kinds of self-talk. Like, yeah, it's because you had that extra serving of ice cream. That you don't have the willpower and, you're unhappy. It's all your fault. Like we're very, very harsh. Our inner critic can be really harsh and it engages in blaming. And it's for the same reason as people who are blamers blame others. It's to defend against feeling emotional pain through further exposure. So what the blamer does within ourselves is it's trying to make us feel bad about the behavior so we don't do it anymore. And it blames. But also it's to make your world really small. If you feel bad about yourself, you're not going to put yourself out there. And then the inner critic will say, okay, we're safe because you're not going to do anything that'll get you in trouble because I've blamed and shamed it out of you.
Yeah, and I think the word is shamed because it goes from it when it blames so much. It wasn't like an incident where I was guilty. And then I became so ashamed. Like everything was my fault. And I just couldn't, I am the worst, right? I couldn't get myself out of it until finally I did the work that was required to get out of it and to separate myself.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a little tricky one. We're used to thinking about blamers that are outside of ourselves or in our organizations or in our family. But, just stop for a minute and recognize that you may be someone who has a pretty harsh inner critic and there's blame going on inside there. So Some of these strategies might also help. I mean, we do refer you back to the imposter syndrome because we cover the inner critic, and we'll put a link down at the bottom for that episode. But just have that in the back of your mind. I just wanted to mention that. Now, Karen, you can speak a little bit more to how this shows up in organizations.
Yeah, when we talk about teams and organizations, there's typically can be a blame culture that actually is very damaging if you think about it. Why? It's because it can stifle innovation. It could be where people don't come together and really work together, point fingers. This is why it failed. This is why it failed. It's something about why did it fail and figuring out, well, what can we do next time? You focus on shifting the blame or identifying who's to blame, right? There's got to be the person who is to blame. And so what happens is nobody wants to take the risk or speak up, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they don't want to be the scapegoated if things go wrong. I really think a lot about in the organizations, we forget that when we blame, it really undermines accountability. And it's something that in organizations, there's so much work trying to get people to feel accountable. And when no one's willing to own up to their mistakes because they're afraid they're going to get fired or they're going to get in trouble or performance is going to come down or whatever, especially now with the increased scrutiny, it's impossible to learn from your mistakes and improve because you're so scared. So an example I was thinking a lot about, the more you have organizations or departments that are just working within their own department, right? You don't have cross-functional teams as the way you work together to solve a problem for the client. It tends to be more stovepipe. The more stovepipe it is or singular department working on, it's easier to blame another group. It's easier to say this is this person's fault because either before or after they didn't do their work. It's their fault because when I got it, there's mistakes there and really it's their fault. And then they keep pointing back and back and back. And the same thing happens on the other way, where people will say, well, I did my part. It must be their part. Because when I got it, it was perfect. So you either blame it before you got it or after you bought it. That's what I think has happened. And it shows the fact that departments are working within their own and they care only about themselves. So I think what is interesting is this happens all over the place. And it's for us to really bring this to your attention and to be the one that stops it. When you hear somebody in an organization blaming another organization, it's getting together, figuring out what is really the issue. So I think this is an exciting topic for us to discuss.
Well, let's move into the best practices then for dealing with blaming and blame shifting. Karen, why don't we start with feeling it in your body and then getting grounded so you can avoid reacting emotionally?
So I think it's so reactionary, right? When you feel blame, you automatically want to defend yourself and react, right? You want to shift it. And escalating the situation won't help. So instead, we want you to really take the moment to breathe and stay calm. You unclench and then you breathe. And that's really critical to do because you'll notice it. You'll notice the fact that you will clench because that's our defensive normal mode. And then when you're able to respond, because after you're calm, you can respond with the composure and curiosity that helps you reduce the tension. And that allows for a more productive conversation to find out what really is going on. Because in the end, it's not one person or the other person's fault. It could be neither. It could be a combination. Who knows? But you go in with as a researcher to figure out what can we do next time?
And if you've been following this channel, you'll be starting to notice that there's certain themes and certain strategies that go throughout. And this first one, which is to get grounded, calm your body, unclench and breathe. Remember, the reason that's always the first step is because these defense strategies and difficult behaviors come from that survival mechanism. So we have to get out of our lizard brain. And that requires us to get calm so that we can turn our new brain on. So it's almost always the first step. So we hope over time it'll start coming as second nature for you. The next thing that you would do when you're dealing with a blamer after you calm yourself down is this is where you start engaging in trying to seek some clarity. And you could use the strategy that we like, the advocacy with inquiry. And again, we'll put the link to the episode below. And it sounds like this situation happened and you were pointing over here. Like, what are your thoughts on how that all came about? So you're inviting the person, you're kind of acknowledging they're saying that the responsibility is someplace else, but instead of either just running after that shiny object or turning and saying you're just a blamer and doing an accusation, you want to bring this sort of collaborative communication on board to try to get the person to engage in more productive problem identification or identifying what are all the other parts that contributed. And for chronic blamers, this is a strategy. If you're dealing with someone who's a chronic blamer and they're just incredibly reluctant to take any personal responsibility, when you're doing this inquiry, a really effective strategy is the long, uncomfortable silence. So you ask a question and say their first response, it was, well, I don't know anything about it. You need to go talk to John. And then you do the inquiry and say, well, now this was supposed to be, I know, your assignment, but can you just walk me through what did you do with it? And then just be really quiet, because they might stammer. They might be like, well, I don't have any answers. You need to talk. I don't know. And even if it's like, well, I don't know, like teenagers, just stay quiet and look at them with a kind of an open expression on your face, a curious, like, okay. The thing is, the power of a long, uncomfortable silence is, if you remember, blaming is about getting out of the uncomfortable emotions. And so when you just stay quiet, you're actually forcing them to sit back in the uncomfortable emotions. And in that agitation, defenses will start to crumble. The person is going to try other strategies to get out of it. And they actually often will come up with a partial answer. I mean, this is like a ninja strategy that I was trying to think of how to explain how this works. But all I can tell you is the uncomfortable long pause is incredibly effective in causing the initial strategy to break down. And then the person will start, trying to figure out what they should do now. And honestly, the easiest thing is just to give some actual information. They'll actually come forward hoping you'll go away. But then you stay with the inquiry and you keep drilling down more and more with those long, uncomfortable pauses, and you're going to get more of the data extracted out of that conversation. So this one's a more advanced skill. If you're interested in it, like, just put a question in the comments and maybe we'll do a whole episode on the long, uncomfortable silence.
Christina, I was going to also say it's important that you have to decide to be okay with the silence, because I know for myself, I tend to want to save people. And, and that's the whole point of counter to the uncomfortable silence. Yes. You really have to be willing to not come in and save that person. You have to be willing to come to what the solution is and use you. So what did you do first? Because that allows them to go back to the time. So when it happened, was your first move, right? So when you use the word you, if you're pointing at them, and you can even start with, this is what I did. What did you do first? And it could be bringing you an example, because it's not just, so we both had parts in it, right? But it's not to blame again. It's that curiosity. And that's what you have to make sure you go in, said, with curiosity, which means you don't go in with blame, like it's your fault, but you're like, so what could have happened? It's like really thinking of yourself as a researcher trying to figure it out. That doesn't involve you guys, but you ask like questions that you're trying to figure out.
Yeah, I think that is such a good point, because you're absolutely right. This is why I said this is more of an advanced skill. Most people themselves will be uncomfortable with the long silence and they'll jump in. The blamer is counting on you on doing that. So when you're just sitting in silence and maybe they give you a little crumb to get you off their back, and then you're quiet for a moment and you can just go, okay, and then what?
Exactly.
And then another long silence, because then they have to give you another one. Folks, I'm just telling you, this is one of the best strategies to cultivate and learn. the thing is nice that I like about it, it's not about escalating. It's not about counter accusing. You're staying in that inquiry, but you're doing it in this really ninja way that creates more discomfort that the blame is trying to get out of. And what you're sort of subtly saying is, that's not going to get you out of the discomfort. Having this conversation is the only path out of the discomfort. So Karen's right. You have to be strong to be able to use this one. Okay, so let me go on. After you do that, and what Karen was just actually saying, she kind of touched into the next one, is own what you can that might be your part, because then you're role modeling accountability. Even if it's just a small part, you want to just go ahead and show that owning a mistake or acknowledging, the sky doesn't fall if you do that. Lightning bolt doesn't come out of the sky. You do it in a really calm way, a confident way. And people who are blaming, it's an instinctive thing, but it's not really their nature. Creating that safety can invite a person to see, oh, it's okay. Wait, they're also accountable, because now we feel a connection. Oh, they're taking a piece of it, so I must not be bad. Now, the only place I have to caution you is if you're with someone who's just a chronic blamer, who just uses it almost in a manipulative way, the fear that people will say is, well, I don't want to give them ammo, because if I own part of it, they're going to turn around and double down. So when you do this, you own what you can, but you have to be really clear on your boundaries when you do this skill, so that if something else comes flying at you, more monkey poo comes flying at you, you could say, no, this part, that was my piece, but I'm not going to own the whole thing. Like, that's your part. You have to be willing to also be assertive and have those boundaries and communicate those boundaries, so that this isn't used against you.
Exactly. So this is what we were talking about earlier, is the importance of redirecting the conversations also to the solutions. Because when you address the immediate issue, you have to, when you're having this discussion, is focusing on solving the problem. It's not about the person. It's about the problem and their role in the department. And sometimes that's what's really critical to mind you. We're trying to solve the problem so it doesn't happen again. This is where you want to come out with your intention, right? So that sets the tone. And you can say something like, I understand where you're coming from. How can we work together to fix this? How can we work together to solve this so it doesn't happen again? It's moving from the blame type of intention to a collaboration. Right? Because we know most things isn't one singular person that does it. There's a lot of other things that happen.
Yeah. And then I mentioned this previously, but I just want to reemphasize skill number 5, set boundaries with chronic blame shifters. So for that person who is chronically shifting blame, it's important to set those boundaries. You might have to be direct and saying something more like, I notice that when issues arise, the focus tends to be on assigning blame rather than solving the problem. So let's work on how we can improve this dynamic. So when Karen's talking about redirecting the conversation, once again, that has to go hand in hand with having boundaries on where you are going to let the conversation go and where it's not going to go. And that boundary is around, we're not going to engage in the blame game. This is what we are going to engage in. And then you look at what is in my control to have influence on the direction of that conversation, and what action am I going to take to make sure that we are not stuck in the blame game.
Now, the last one that we're talking about is about promoting accountability, right? It'd be great if every organization had a culture of accountability, but that's not the case. From what the research has shown, that's not the case. In fact, they may say it, but in actuality, it becomes in your work team whether or not you really do, accept accountability, but have to feel safe to accept accountability. You don't get in trouble, you get fired. You have to make a decision as a team, as a group, that accountability is crucial. So if you have accountability, that really means that mistakes are always seen as learning opportunities. Right? And you're focusing more on the problem or the issue than you are on the person. Because it could have happened to anybody, but because that person was doing it, there might have been a thing with the process. Who knows? This is where you have to remind people, it's not about you. Sometimes it's the how you did it. And that's what's really important, that you start to reinforce this with your own team norms. So it's really important that you have team norms, you have regular check-ins. You may even, what I found very helpful is you even celebrate the mistakes and how you celebrate and you say, so what was something that mistake that we made that we learned from, right? And you celebrate those in your team meetings. And most importantly, you as a singular person, you may think, I can't do anything. I can't do anything because it's my team. It's my team. I can't change it because I'm not the team leader. But in actuality, you can begin to model the behavior yourself, and you have much more power to switch this, because the more you take the issue, I realize this process that I'm doing it's not right. Let's talk about how we can switch it. You can actually direct a conversation so it becomes more collaborative, or even if someone's blaming someone else, and say, well, let's take a step back here for a second and engage in that conversation to facilitate it.
Well, and I would say if you're in that situation that Karen's describing, you're a team member and you feel like you don't have this power, or you have some concern that the environment isn't safe. If you're in a culture that hasn't yet developed accountability as one of its principles, and there's a lot of blame that's going on, it may not even feel safe to role model, to step up, but you can make it safer. You could talk to your own supervisor and say, this is a value that I have, is taking responsibility and accountability. I'm not seeing that in this culture, but I would like to be a leader and role model because it aligns with my values. I just want to make sure you're aware, because here's my concern of what can happen. And you're basically getting an allyship. You want to get a supervisor who understands you are intentionally doing that. And I said, that would be fantastic. I would love it if you did that. Now, if someone tries to take what you say and use it against you, you've kind of got your back covered.
Yeah. And I wouldn't be scared, because these are days we need to be able to work with more accountability than blaming. So I do believe that most managers would love that. Yeah. So before we wrap up, I think it's worth taking a moment to reflect on our own boundaries and tendencies. None of us are immune to the urges to blame. As we said earlier, it's from way, 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 way back that we have it. And we have a cultural issue too. And likely we might do it without ever realizing it. So by cultivating self-awareness, which we talk a lot about, we can begin to catch ourselves in these moments and choose a different approach. So what I want to ask you to ask yourself is, am I contributing to a blame culture? And how can I model accountability instead?
And then the other thing is self-awareness. It'll help you have compassion. If you're in a relationship with somebody who tends to use blaming, if you're aware of your own times when you use blaming to get out of that discomfort, it'll help you not be reactive with the other person, because you'll have more empathy and compassion. We can have compassion towards others, and we can have patience with doing these other strategies of getting grounded, engaging in inquiry to get more clear, to have those boundaries. Because when you can be calm in yourself, you just do a much better job. So we hope that this has been helpful and given you a foundation for starting to deal with blamers in your life. So remember that driving the behavior is this very human instinct to avoid emotional pain. Look to cultivate that compassion. And then by applying these strategies, we can create more constructive, accountable, and positive environments, both in our personal life and for those of you who are in a work situation, hopefully in your professional life.
And so we want to thank you again for tuning into this episode of Simply Human. If you found this discussion helpful, don't forget to subscribe and share it with someone else who might benefit. We'd love to hear your thoughts. So feel free to reach out on the simplyhuman.connect@gmail.com. You can also put a comment below or text us in the show notes. Until next time, let's keep moving towards compassion and accountability.
See you later, guys.
Bye.